Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. And our topic of this week is literary criticism, which is going to form a huge portion of the work that we do in this course. So when we are talking about literary criticism, taking a look at this term, think about for a moment what associations you have with this term. If you've ever studied literary criticism before, you should be familiar with it, but most students haven't really studied it formally up until this point. When we talk about criticism, you might be familiar with that word when someone gives you feedback, often negative feedback, or something like constructive criticism to see how you can improve. That's not really the type of criticism that we're referring to. When we talk about literary criticism, similar to art criticism or cultural criticism, it means to take a critical eye or a sort of sharper look at something, in this case, literature. So literary criticism means focusing in on the literature and doing close readings in order to perform criticism, which we're going to start doing this week. When we talk about literary criticism, we need to establish some terms, and those main terms are literary theory versus literary criticism. So what is the difference between these two terms? They're very closely related to one another, but it's important that we recognize the difference. So literary theory are the ideas behind this practice. So these ideas act as different lenses that critics use to view and talk about art, literature, and even culture. So when we're talking about theory in the sense of this course, we're talking about literary theory, these different ideas that we focus on in the text. So you can think of literary theory as like the noun version or the concept. The ideas that act as different lenses. And I'm going to be coming back around to this idea of different lenses. These different lenses allow critics to focus on particular aspects of the work that they consider to be important. So depending on which lens of literary theory we're focused on, we'll focus on different aspects of the work that are considered important. And when focusing on them, we'll analyze them, breaking them down to their significance and responding in the form of an essay. On the other hand, we have literary criticism. Literary criticism is like the verb version of this idea. So we have literary theory, which is the noun or the idea, also the concept behind this practice. And then we have the actual practice itself, or the verb of literary criticism. So to perform literary criticism, that involves writing, that analyzes, evaluates, and interprets literature. And that might include discussion. So it's possible to perform literary criticism in a spoken manner, as if you're in the classroom and we're sitting around in a circle and we're breaking down or analyzing a work of literature and evaluating different aspects of the literature and interpreting the meaning behind the text. And we could do that in a spoken way, but for the purposes of this course, it's all done in the form of writing. And the good news is you have already been doing this. You have already been performing literary criticism. Most students, by the time they reach this course, have already performed literary criticism, whether they realized it or not. So anytime you've been asked to read a work of fiction or a memoir or a poem, and then you were asked to look at the significance of that work, you were performing literary criticism. Depending on which literary theory, you may have focused on different aspects of the work. And I'll come to some examples a little bit later on. Those examples will be very clear to you by the end of this section. So when we talk about literary theory, we use the term lenses. So there are different lenses or these different ideas or different sort of focal points that we use to discuss the perspective through which we will analyze a work of literature. So literary criticism is performed by looking through these different lenses of literary theory. So I want you to imagine for a second putting on different types of glasses. So you walk into a sunglass store, and some of the sunglasses have a orange tint, and when you put them on, everything looks orange, even the sky. And some glasses might have a prescription in them, and when you put them on, everything looks kind of blurry because it's not your prescription. And some sunglasses might have different tones or different prescription strengths, so as you look through them, you see the world in a different way. Another student of mine referred to the lenses as like filters on Instagram. So you can think of it that way. These lenses are all about the perspective through which you're going to analyze a work of literature. Another word for lenses are the schools of literary theory. And there are many, many schools of literary theory. And what I mean by that is there are many perspectives to take when analyzing literature. So imagine yourself again putting on different pairs of glasses and analyzing the literature, looking at it in a new way depending on which lens you're using. So here's a sample of some of the lenses of literary theory. The first one here, formalism or new criticism, this is what we are focusing on this week. And later on in the module, you can see some lectures on formalism that explains what formalism's lens focuses on. We're also going to be studying feminist theory or the feminist lens of literary theory, which means later on in the semester, we're going to look at some works of literature and we're going to analyze them through the feminist lens. And more on that in later weeks. There also is Marxist literary theory, which we're not covering in this course, but later on you can see some examples of Marxist theory. Marxist literary theory looks at literature and analyzes it based on elements such as economics and power. There's also psychoanalytic theory, which we will cover later on when we talk about Between the World and Me, as well as critical race and post-colonial theory, which is important to our understanding of reading modern texts. Critical race and post-colonial theory are two of the newest lenses through which literary critics perform literary criticism. So you can imagine looking through a lens to analyze a work of literature to understand how elements of race and colonialism or post-colonialism could affect that work of literature and, more importantly, affect our analysis of that literature. There's also new historicism, which unfortunately we don't have time to cover in this course. And this is also a small sample of the main schools of literary theory. There are other literary theory schools or lenses that I'm just not covering today. It's important to recognize that in this class, we're only going to really focus on 3 lenses because that's all we have time to become good at. And we're starting with formalism. When you're reading, there are 2 different types of reading that you might be doing. The first one is aesthetic reading, or reading for the experience. Some people refer to this as reading for pleasure, but I actually prefer to think of it as reading for the emotional response. So when you're reading for fun, you might think, reading for fun or reading because you love to get immersed in the world of literature, that is aesthetic reading. You can also read aesthetically when you're not trying to get a positive emotion. If you're hate reading something, similar to hate watching a TV show like reality TV or a competition show. So aesthetic reading is all about the experience, all about how you feel as you're reading. And it's not really focused on the individual details, but rather the kind of bigger picture that's painted in your brain. On the other hand, we have efferent reading. And a lot of students are used to efferent reading, which is another way of saying reading for information, reading for facts, dates, names, and numbers, like the type of reading that you do for a test or a quiz. When you're studying for an exam, you're often doing efferent reading, skimming through the text, looking for information such as important terms, dates, facts, or even formulas if you're taking a science or math exam, and then you memorize them quickly, shove them into your brain, spit them out onto the test, and then forget that you ever had them in your brain in the first place. Forget about them completely as soon as you walk out the door. So the reason I bring this up is it's important to note that when you're reading literature, you are not doing efferent reading. So you shouldn't be scanning through these works looking for the important names and dates or plot points. You should focus your attention on aesthetic reading, or reading for the experience and the emotional response. And this is why I'm such a strong advocate of printing out the works and having them in paper so that you can annotate the readings. That's the best way to keep track of your emotional experience and emotional response as you're reading. And it will be critically necessary to perform literary criticism, because students often will read through a text once without annotating it, and they think, oh, well, that was kind of a boring story, or nothing really happened. You might have even had that experience already when reading Hills Like White Elephants. And then you go back and you see when other people spent the time annotating and digging into the text, reading between the lines, seeking the emotional response just underneath the surface, they get so much more out of it, and they find they have something to analyze when it comes to writing a response, whether it's on the discussion board or whether it's doing your essay assignments. And that's what literary criticism is all about. So keep in mind that you might be doing aesthetic reading when you're reading literature. It's even a good idea at the top of every reading assignment to write what type of reading you're doing. Is it aesthetic reading? And you can come up with a symbol like AR, or you can write ER for efferent reading when you might need to do that for another class, or possibly even for some information-dense texts in this course. So we're starting with formalism or new criticism. Formalism or new criticism is my favorite lens to begin this course with, because in my opinion, formalism is one of the easier lenses of literary theory. And so it's one of the easier ways that students can get started performing literary criticism. So I have a quote here from Sergei Prokofiev. He said, "Formalism is music that people don't understand at first hearing." So formalism can apply to other things like art or culture or music. In this case, we're talking about literature. So formalism is music that people don't understand at first hearing. What that says to me is that there are layers underneath the text. The text is like an iceberg, which is a metaphor I'll be using a lot in this course. There are layers underneath the text, and we have to analyze them after our first hearing, because we won't necessarily recognize them if we just skim through the text. So what is formalism / new criticism? I'm going to be talking a lot about that this week, and so you'll see there's some other lectures on Moodle about formalism or new criticism, but I wanted to just make sure everybody is on the same page about literary theory and what I mean by that, and literary criticism and what I mean by the practice of that. So some questions you might ask yourself are, how does the work use something like imagery, for example, to develop its own symbols? Imagery is a really common element of formalism for analysis. For example, there's quite a bit of imagery in Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me about the concept of the American dream. Now, we're not getting into that text just yet, but keep in mind that when we're reading, he's not necessarily referring to an actual dream or the American dream as we traditionally think of it. He's using imagery to develop his own message, and that message is very different than you might think upon first reading. You might also ask yourself, how are the various parts of the work connected? Or how do these parts contribute to the overall work? Or what literary elements are present in the work? Literary elements is something I'm going to cover in my next lecture, which dives a bit deeper into the elements, or as I like to call them, the Lego pieces that make up formalism. And lastly, you might look, is there a central passage that can be said to sum up the entirety of the work? So sometimes I ask my students to select a golden line from a work of literature, and what they're actually doing is practicing looking for a key piece of evidence from which to begin their formalist criticism. So that pretty much sums up a quick introduction to literary criticism and literary theory. Literary criticism often intimidates students in the beginning, so just know that it's a lot of practice that we're doing at this stage. I do ask that you take the time to read and annotate these texts multiple times. That's really going to help all of you when it comes down to performing your analysis. But the best part about literary analysis is that it's up to your own interpretation. So when I talk about formalism and I talk about some of the terms that you might find in a formalist analysis, you have your own choice of what formalist elements or formalist terms you are going to apply to your literary criticism of the works that we're reading this week and in future weeks. So take a look at this lecture and take a look at the next lectures that gets more into the detail of what exactly entails this critical lens of formalism / new criticism. Thanks for watching.